Hey guys, so I did a stream with Ace 1918 yesterday, reviewed the Old Republic, and kind of got me thinking a little bit. See, I've been watching a bunch of Star Wars videos recently, and I had a playlist all set up that was just YouTube videos on Jedi Master Ki-Adi-Mundi. Ki-Adi-Mundi? Yeah. Because he was one of my favorite Jedi Masters. Now, there's a few reasons for that. But when you watch a lot of the videos that talk about his lore, people like to rank the Jedi Masters based on how good of a general they were, how good they were for the Order, whether or not they are corrupt or arrogant or ignorant. And a lot of people, I'm just going to call him Ki. A lot of people rank Ki really low on their scales. And here's the thing about that. Because I have to get into how people view Star Wars. Now, in general, everyone's got political opinions, left or right. And people kind of see the world in those opinions. Now, in a broad generalization, people on the right wing view entertainment as something that should be apolitical, and therefore you shouldn't get anything out of it. It shouldn't affect your political views, and you shouldn't use your political views to interpret it. Whereas on the left-hand side, you often hear everything is political being thrown around, meaning that everything has a political message, or everything can be interpreted through politics, which I disagree with. Now, I consider myself more on the right-leaning side of things. And it just so happens that I believe the Republicans, not all Republicans, but the MAGA wing of Republicans, have been the more sane version of the party, as opposed to the older rhinos, or you can also call them neocons, depending on how you want to interpret those two terms. I don't like the McConnell wing of the Republican Party. I think they're corrupt, and I think that they don't care on what the average right-wing or center-right-wing voter wants. Anyways. But for Star Wars, you have to keep in mind that George Lucas and a bunch of the writers, editors, and what have you kind of lean on the left-hand side of things, as well as most of the actors. So they since everything in general for the left-hand side is political, therefore you can probably get on the right-hand side, if you don't view everything as political, when you watch entertainment, you then have to kind of flip a switch in your head to try to see if there's a political message in, for example, Star Wars. So, if the writers, the editors, the actors are left-wing, can you see them trying to make a left-wing point in Star Wars? And then, when you listen to someone who reviews it, a lot of reviews that you will find online are vastly different from reviews from the average viewer, because a lot of reviewers are often left-wing too. So when you're watching a bunch of videos on YouTube, you have to assume that the people who are making the videos on Star Wars are either right-wing and apolitical, or they're left-wing and and they interpret political messages in Star Wars. So assuming that there's 50-50 of both, hell, even if it's like 90% right-wing people reviewing Star Wars and 10% who are left-wing, one will be completely balanced and apolitical, and there will be at least a small amount of people who see a left-wing message in the movies. And since they're written by left-wing people, then generally the opinions you'll get will be slanted towards the left, ever so slightly. Now, for Ki-Adi-Mundi, a lot of people give him a really hard time. And there's a bunch of reasons, whether you just look at the movies or you look at the expanded universe, which in the George Lucas days was Legends, which had different forms of canon. Like, they had B, C, D, and E canon, I think. And then, or you view it from the new canon, which is Disney canon, which leans left-wing more than Lucas did. So Lucas tried to keep real-world politics out of Star Wars, but he would like compare it to real-world events. Whereas Disney went like full left-wing with a lot of the stuff that they wrote, because a lot of writers did not have the strength of character or the restraint to keep modern messaging out of Star Wars. So, as someone who's right-wing, I kind of have to keep that in mind when I listen to these reviews. But even if you just look at Legends and the movies, just look at the movies, look at the movies and canon, or look at the movies, canon, and Legends, you get a lot of people who think Ki-Adi-Mundi was not that great of a Jedi Master. And there's a few reasons for that. Now, I'm just gonna like mix Legends and canon together here because they actually aren't that different for Ki between them. In Star Wars, Ki-Adi-Mundi came from a planet where his species is mostly female. And men have many wives. Now in the Middle East, where Islam was formed, a lot of men went to war. And this is in general. A lot of men go to war. A lot of men end up dying. Therefore, you have a lot more women than men. So in the Middle East, to kind of make it more balanced, men, since there was less men and more females, that meant that they decided that a single man can have multiple wives, but a wife can only have one husband. So that all the females could have children and restock the population after wartime. Now, in Ki-Adi-Mundi's case, I really should just call him Ki, because I always say Ki-Mundi when it's Ki-Adi-Mundi. So in Ki's case, his species is kind of forced into that because 1 out of every 20 children is male. Now, I've talked about this before. Men who have a lot of stress or spend a lot of time around radios apparently produce more female offspring than they do male offspring. And there's scientific reasons for that. But in the case of Ki's race, that is enforced across the board. 1 male for every 19 females. So his race, anytime there's a male, the male has to have many wives in order to keep the production rate up, so that the population doesn't fall off a cliff. So he was allowed to have several wives by the Jedi Council. And people get upset about that because, well, Anakin couldn't have a wife. Why could Ki have a wife? Like, have multiple wives and multiple children. Like, attachments are not allowed. Well, they ordered Ki that you cannot form attachments with your family. You basically just... what's the English saying is... One of the queens of England or the UK said that she just lays down and thinks of England when she has to produce an heir. Now, apparently she was joking. But basically, he is allowed to mate, have kids, but he's not allowed to feel any emotions for his wife and his kids, which is very difficult for him. And it's only because his race is special, whereas the human race has basically taken over the Star Wars galaxy. They're like the majority population of the Republic and later on the Empire. Or at least a good plurality of the population. Like, a good percentage. Like, they have the highest population of any race in the Star Wars universe. And now that's, from a technical standpoint, that's obvious because costumes are expensive. So it's just easier to make everybody human instead of trying to go the Star Trek route and put a ridge on everybody's head and say that, oh no, that's a different race. That's not a human race. What are you talking about? But yeah. So people look down at him for two reasons. One, he's allowed to have wives and children, while Anakin, the main character, was not. While at the same time, he's also technically a terrible husband and a terrible father because he's not allowed to form attachments with his wife and kids. Now, from a right-wing perspective, we would just be like, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense. That's how the Jedi work, so we can't really judge him for being a bad father. Or from the left-wing perspective that sees everything as political, again, in general, this is not the case for everyone on the right wing and everyone on the left wing, just in general, they see him as being privileged because he gets more privileges than the average Jedi while allowing to be a Jedi Master. Well, other people, everyone else, aren't privileged. Like, Ki-Adi-Mundi is the bourgeoisie, basically. He is the most privileged person in the Jedi Order because he's the only one allowed to have a wife and kids. And not only that, he's allowed to have multiple wives and multiple kids. So people who review him kind of get turned off by him because, well, he's the privileged guy. Obviously, that's a problem for them. Because Democrats, left-wingers, communists, anyone kind of on the left-wing side, even if you're center-left, don't like privilege. Don't like people who get more than other people. But in exchange, Ki-Adi-Mundi is allowed to have wives and kids, but he also has to deal with the emotions of having a wives and kids, and then hurt his own, like, emotional state by not being able to give them the attention that they need, not being able to give them the emotional support they need. So when they get upset, angry, sad, what have you, he has to kind of use logic to explain. It's like, no, you shouldn't be upset or sad. Like, he can't connect with them on an emotional level. And that's kind of depressing because he knows that that's not right either. But he can't let himself get too emotional. He can't get himself worked up with their problems, even if their problems are caused by him. So that's the trade-off for him. The other reason why a lot of people don't like him is that in the movies, he's often used as the guy, he's the extra on the Jedi Council who talks. So he has to say something. And they need somebody on the council who's the contrarian. Like the guy who says something that, like, Yoda and Mace Windu disagree with. So when Qui-Gon Jinn comes into the council room and he says, the Sith are back, Ki-Adi-Mundi is the one who's like, that's impossible. The Sith haven't existed for 1,000 years. And a lot of people look at that and see him as ignorant, like slow to trust, like not willing to take new data and like reform his worldview, closed-minded basically. But from a lore perspective, what he's saying is completely correct. Is that they know that the Sith haven't been around for a long time, and in the lore, there's only 2 Sith at any time. And they thought that system too was destroyed long ago because the rule of 2 predated Darth Bane. So if you're not aware, there was this guy named Revan, who was a Jedi Master, or a Jedi Knight, I think, technically. And he fell to the dark side. And then he created the rule of 2. And then he redeemed himself, went back into the light, but left his information on the rule of 2 out there in the world. And he was either killed, or he was never able to go back and destroy his theory on the rule of 2. So the Sith had like hundreds and hundreds of members. And eventually, they all destroyed themselves, wiping out a Jedi strike group. And what it turned out was that Darth Bane found the rule of 2, decided to use it, and then tricked all the other Sith to use a power that would destroy all of them. And he was the only one who wasn't there when the Sith were destroyed. And then he started the rule of 2 in secret. So the Jedi didn't know about it. Now when Ki-Adi-Mundi, like what Ki says is that the Sith haven't existed for 1,000 years. He doesn't say that Darksiders don't exist. Because a lot of people fall to the dark side, but they're not Sith. Sith is like a specific religion, a specific like ideology. Whereas Darksiders can just be somebody who decided to use the dark side and either be selfish and keep all the power to themselves, or they had like a goal that was different from the Sith goal. So what Ki is suggesting in actuality is that the person that Qui-Gon fought on Tatooine wasn't a Sith, but some dark side user. Either somebody who had been in cryosleep for a long time, somebody who fell from the Jedi Order, somebody they thought dead, or somebody who had left the Jedi Order and was no longer like in contact with the Jedi and therefore fell to the dark side. He wasn't saying that, oh no, that was just some random dude. That wasn't a dark side user. No, he knew he was a dark side user. Now, Ki-Adi-Mundi's species also has 2 brains and 2 hearts. And one brain can think one thing and the other brain can think another thing. But they're linked. So basically, they can consider a point, like one point of view in one brain, and another point of view in another brain, and then the two brains together come to a conclusion. Basically, the two brains can argue with each other, and then they come to a consensus. So his species is a very logical species. And very quickly, he is like, no, there's no way that was a Sith. That was just a Darksider. What are you talking about? And later on, as more information comes out, he eventually realizes, okay, it might be a Sith, but, well, we don't really know anything about that, so we need to just keep going until we eliminate Dooku anyways, and that will make the point moot anyways. We just gotta defeat Dooku and defeat his apprentice or multiple apprentice, which he had a Solid Ventress, and then a later Savage Opress, and I think that was it for his apprentices. So if you just eliminate those three people, if they are Sith, then the point's moot, the Sith are destroyed. And later on, eventually, Yoda thinks that he's hearing the voice of Qui-Gon. And he says basically that Qui-Gon is a Force ghost. He found a way to keep his consciousness in the afterlife. Which Ki-Adi-Mundi, again, disagrees with and thinks that the dark side is starting to take over Yoda. Everyone gets on Ki's case about that, saying, oh, he's so stupid. Why would he think the Grand Master fell to the dark side? That's dumb. Right? But, again, you have to think of it from his point of view. Now, if you look at the Vader comics, well, if you look at the lore in general, light side users don't keep their consciousness in the Force. They accept death. They accept their consciousness being reabsorbed into the living Force. And the light side users cannot talk to people from beyond the grave. They're just gone. Their consciousness disappears. And it's seen as unfairly holding on to life. Like, your consciousness is a resource that the Force gave to your body. And when you die, you're supposed to give that energy back to the Force, dissolving your consciousness, and trying to exist beyond death as a conscious force goes against the will of the Force. And Ki believed that Qui-Gon was a stellar Jedi, and therefore he would let go of his consciousness and not try to cling on to some semblance of his being in the afterlife. The thing about the Force Ghosts, though, is they were trained by light side users, either a species or some embodiment of the Force called the Wills. Some creatures, either formed by the Force or an alien species, so attuned to the light side that they might as well be considered like a fundamental force of the light side. And so powerful in the light side that they could, as it turns out, create Anakin. Or was Anakin created by Palpatine and Plagueis, creating new life? Well, it's kind of hard to tell. Neither Legends or canon definitively answers that question. You can say that some Force visions hint at it, at the answer, but other Force visions hint at the opposite answer. Was Anakin created by the Wills, or was he created by Plagueis? Again, hard to tell. But getting back to the topic, what the Wills teach Qui-Gon is how to keep his consciousness in the Force while completely and utterly abiding by what the Force wants and being completely in tune with the light side. So he is able to keep his consciousness, but he only acts when the Force tells him it's the time to act. And he only says as much as the Force kind of wants him to say at the time. Now, he keeps his personality and he keeps his free will, but he has subserviated himself to the light side of the Force, even beyond death. Which is something so out of the ballpark for the Jedi that it kind of seems to be a contradictory statement. But it's such a fine balance between keeping your consciousness while still abiding by the Force, the will of the Force, that it seems like it would be an impossible thing to balance. It would be like trying to balance a magnet on top of another magnet. You can't do it. Except if you use an electromagnet and you spin it in a circle. Basically, that's kind of what the Force Ghosts are doing. Now, just imagine a Force Ghost spinning in a rapid circle, but it's just an analogy. Don't think too hard on how that works. Anywho, looking from Ki's point of view, he knows that light side users cannot exist as a conscious force inside the afterlife. But dark side users sorta can, in a way. And they know this for several reasons. One is called the Talisman of Myrrh, which has been around for a long time. And I talk about the Talisman of Myrrh in the stream I did yesterday on Ace 1918's channel. And it's Republic comic 24, Knights of the Old Republic comic 24-25, and it's his part 18 on the Knights of the Old Republic comic series, if anyone wants to look it up, if you want to go watch it. And I explain what the Talisman of Myrrh is. Basically, that and the Helmet of Momin from the Vader comics, which is what I was going to mention earlier. What Myrrh did and what Momin did is when they died, they put their consciousness in an object. For Myrrh, it was his talisman. For Momin, it was his helmet. And while that is a way to cheat going into the afterlife and having their consciousness dissolved, as long as they're inside an object, they don't go into the living force, and their free will and consciousness are not overwhelmed by the Force. They're basically able to exist in the object. Now, in the case of Momin, when you pick up his helmet, he tempts you to put it on, and if you put it on, he possesses your body and takes you over. And it's unknown if your will is destroyed, absorbed by him, or sent into the living force to be dissolved. But either way, he has full control of your body, and it seems impossible for you to get your consciousness back, because your consciousness is just rendered inert. Now, if you are strong enough in will, you can resist putting on the helmet, and therefore you aren't possessed, and therefore you aren't overtaken. But if you put on the helmet, your will is just overridden for one reason or another. And Vader manages to throw off the helmet before he puts it on his head. Now, if Vader actually put it on, would he be able to eventually fight off Momin, take off the helmet, and put Momin's spirit back into the helmet? Maybe. Don't know. For Myrrh, if you have the amulet, he basically speaks in your ear and tries to tempt you to the dark side. And if your will is weak enough, he takes over your body. But if it's not weak enough, he basically is just like an evil... He just makes all your actions like more dark side aligned. And eventually, if you take it off, give it to somebody else, that person could be taken over completely by Myrrh. So what Ki thinks is happening to Yoda is that he's hearing Qui-Gon, but that's impossible. Qui-Gon would be dead, his consciousness would be gone, and therefore there's no way Yoda could be hearing Qui-Gon. Therefore, somebody on the dark side of things must be pretending to be Qui-Gon and contacting Yoda. And since the dark side is all around, and the dark side is blinding, surrounding Yoda, Mace, basically everybody, and blinding them to what the future holds, Ki is sensing that dark side around Yoda and just assuming that Yoda is falling to the dark side because he's hearing what must be a dark side user pretending to be Qui-Gon. Which is not a bad assumption to make, honestly. It's entirely logical and reasonable. And then everyone who, like, is ranking Ki is like, oh, well, that means he's ignorant. He's not allowing himself to see the greater possibilities that light side users can exist in the afterlife as a conscious force. And not only that, he's also narrow-minded enough, dogmatic enough, and he represents everything that's wrong with the Jedi Order. The thing is that if he went and talked to the Wills himself, he would know, he would learn this ability, the Force Ghost ability, and he would realize, oh, okay, like, this is a thing. I wasn't as trained as I thought I was. Like, he would be humble enough to, if given enough evidence, to realize that he was wrong. But that's not what people assume. People just assume that no matter what you tell him, he would never, like, realize the truth. So everyone sees him as everything that's wrong with the Jedi Order. And I don't see it that way. I actually see him as, like, one of the best Jedi there are. One of, like, the best ones there is. The other reason a lot of people judge him, and this one is off to me. In the stories, the guy, his commander, who eventually executes him during Order 66, doesn't like him because so many clones had died under Ki's watch. And people see that as him being a closed-minded guy who doesn't adapt to military situations because he's closed-minded. And therefore, since he's not tactically and strategically sound decision maker, that he got more clones killed than other Jedi generals. Which could be true. It could not be true. It could be he was with them long enough to train them himself to be better than they were. So, the quality of his troops reflects him on him. Now, did he go into some of the hardest tactical and strategic situations and that caused the higher casualty rates? Or were the higher casualty rates caused because he went into a easy or moderate difficult like battles, and since he wasn't good tactically and strategically, he suffered casualties unnecessarily? And it's kind of hard to tell. That is a very hard thing in real life to decide whether or not he is the best of the best going into the hardest situations and he is tactically and strategically brilliant, but because it's such a hard battle that they still suffer greater than average casualties? Or did he go into easy or moderately difficult battles and his casualty rate is because of tactical and strategic failures on his part? That is a very hard thing to decide. Either way, we know he had higher casualty rates than other units. Either because he took the hardest challenges and that just caused higher casualties in general, or if he was way above his skis when he was trying to lead troops. Now, he was a frontline leader. He was a frontline general, which generally is not where you want your general to be. You want your general to be in the back, so he gets information from all the frontline commanders, and then he can move them where they need to be, focus on tactics and strategy, and focus on reinforcing, pulling back, sending a flanking unit, and a bunch of other stuff. But all the generals were frontline generals, and their minds were so potent that they could be getting information sent to them while also being able to think through what they're doing and fight at the same time. And since he had two brains, he could focus one brain on fighting and one brain on the tactical and strategic situation. Therefore, him being a frontline general would actually make him, in theory, a better frontline general than a human would, who had to split his one brain into fighting and making tactical and strategic decisions while in the middle of combat. So, in theory, he would actually be a better general than Kenobi or Skywalker. But because he's also a logical person, thinking on very, well-established lines of thought, he could also be less effective as a general in general. So it's kind of hard to tell. But from his commander's point of view, his commander believed that their casualty rates were higher, which was true. Before Order 66, he respected him. After Order 66, he believed that Ki tried to get his men killed on purpose, and that soured him against his general. His respect and admiration for his general suddenly turned to hatred, because suddenly all of his subordinates that he cared so much about died for no reason. And people take that to mean that the commander and his subordinates were gleeful when they killed Ki, because Ki was such a terrible general. Which is, again, kind of a bad assumption to make, because before Order 66, they all loved and respected him. They had PTSD problems from how many people they had lost, because they had been in some of the toughest battles in the entire war. They had taken on some of the toughest challenges, and that was probably why they suffered so many casualties, as opposed to him being tactically and strategically incompetent. So a lot of people take that and judge him as being a terrible general, as being a terrible Jedi. But even if he was a terrible general, Jedi are not supposed to be generals in the first place. They were given command, and therefore you shouldn't judge how good of a Jedi he is based on how good of a general he is. But then you get into the problem is, if he realizes that he's a bad general, then he should give up his position to an actually competent general. And therefore, he's a bad Jedi because he's not able to see that he's a terrible general and give up the general position to somebody who's more competent. And again, these are all bad assumptions. I think the good assumption to make is that he was an average general and a good Jedi. Like one of the best Jedis, which means he should be ranked high. Because every contrary position that he made throughout the movies made sense based on what was either in Legends or was in Disney canon, because they're so similar. Whereas the reasons people look down on him are from a biased perspective in the first place, leaning towards left-wing side of things. So saying that he's everything wrong with the Jedi Order is a complete misnomer. He's everything good about the Order from a dogmatic position. All his positions is what the Jedi believe, and that is good for the Jedi to have, because he won't fall to the dark side, and he will stay as close to the Jedi teachings as possible, and that he should be balanced out by other masters like Obi-Wan Kenobi, who, in my personal opinion, Obi-Wan Kenobi is the best of the Council. Perhaps behind Yoda and Mace Windu. Maybe. From my point of view, like Mace Windu trying to execute Palpatine was probably a good decision. But it just so happened that he and Anakin weren't playing on the same level. Anakin didn't realize where Mace Windu was coming from, and Mace Windu, well, Anakin in theory knew where Mace Windu was coming from, but Mace Windu didn't know where Anakin was coming from, because he didn't know Anakin had a wife and kids on the way. So, and Anakin was blinded by his emotions. Which, if Mace knew what was going on with Anakin, he could be like, well, here's the thing, Anakin. We have Force healers in the Jedi Order. Like, if you really want to learn Force healing, or if you really want somebody to make sure your wife doesn't die in childbirth, just bring her to the temple, and we'll make sure she survives using our Force powers. And then we will discuss whether or not you can stay a Jedi with a wife and kids. Maybe we'll make you an exception like Ki does, or we'll ask that you give up being a Jedi. And Anakin might not be willing to give up being a Jedi, but Mace could be like, look, listen, a lot of people have given up being a Jedi before because they wanted a wife and kids, or because they didn't agree with the Jedi Order. We'll let you resign. We'll set you up with a pension, or whatever their equivalent is, and you can live out your life and raise your kid. Just don't use your Force powers as much. Which again, because Anakin is so obsessed with power, he might not agree to that, and he might fall to the dark side anyways. But if Mace knew what was going on, he could at least be like, look, listen, just let me... You know this guy's too dangerous. We'll get rid of him now, because he's literally armed at all times with the Force, and especially Force lightning. And then we'll bring your wife in, make sure she survives childbirth, and then we'll discuss this, okay? And that would have solved everything. And the problem would be with Obi-Wan not training Anakin correctly, or with Obi-Wan not being like confronting Anakin on the fact that he has a wife, because Obi-Wan definitely almost certainly knew that there was something between Padme and Anakin. Or you can blame it on the fact that Obi-Wan was naive when he trained Anakin, and blame the fact that Qui-Gon didn't survive as being the problem, and then you can't blame Obi-Wan for Anakin's later failings. But blaming Ki-Adi-Mundi for the fall of the Jedi Order doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. And some people's like fan fictions, they have Ki not bring up the droid attack on the Wookiees, which is a meme. And if he doesn't bring that up in the Jedi Council meeting, Yoda doesn't go to Kashyyyk. Therefore, when Palpatine tells Anakin that he's a Sith Lord, Anakin goes back to the Jedi Council and he tells Yoda, and Yoda and Mace go and confront Palpatine, and they successfully defeat him and destroy him in combat before the argument of whether or not he should be arrested even comes up in the first place. Or Yoda balances out Mace and he's like, yeah, we can take him in, we can arrest him, I know how to handle this, so that you and me together can bring him in and he won't be able to fight his way out of this. And we can put him in a prison so strong that he won't be able to escape or manipulate anybody to releasing him. And then we can put him on trial, like Anakin wants. But again, it doesn't answer the problem that Anakin wants Palpatine alive, because Palpatine can tell him how to prevent his wife from dying in childbirth. So Anakin would try to probably break Palpatine out anyways, or if Palpatine was destroyed, he would fall to the dark side anyways, because he would be so angry that now he has lost all opportunity to save his wife. Which, to save his wife, all he had to do was tell Yoda that, hey, I'm married, I have a wife, and my wife's going to die in childbirth, and I need you guys to use your Force healing abilities to heal her, or you have to give me access to the Jedi archives, promote me to Master, so that I can learn the Force healing ability on my own, which is why he was so upset that he wasn't a Master. From what I can tell from the lore, and this is kind of an assumption on my point, which, again, kind of bad decision, possibly, but the logical point of view, and you don't have to see it this way, is that Anakin wanted to be a Master because only the Masters had full access to the Jedi archives, except for maybe a few things that Master Yoda might have access to as the Grand Master. And as a Master, Anakin could then access the Force healing ability tomes, learn that, and learn to use that power that other people learned naturally. Because there are people who are born, like Rey Palpatine, who do have a natural affinity for using Force healing. And Force healing was actually an ability utilized by Jedi during the Republic era. The problem was Anakin couldn't go up to any of them and ask them to be there during the birth of his children, because if he did that, that would be bringing somebody in on the secret, and therefore they would either be duty bound to report Anakin, or it would be just another person that would have to hold on to the secret, and he didn't want to burden anybody with that secret. So while there were people who could Force heal in the Jedi Order, either Anakin didn't know who they were, or if he did, he couldn't tell them about his wife because they would either have to report him or they would have to be brought in on the secret, and they would have to live with the guilt of holding on to that secret. Which either way, Anakin didn't want to do. What Anakin just wanted is he wanted somebody to teach him Force healing. And if he went to ask somebody to train him in it, he would basically have to get permission from the council, or, which would raise a bunch of questions. One thing about the military and organizations in general, the less questions you raise, the better it is for you. Because if more people are asking questions like, if you go up to somebody, it's like, I want to learn Force healing. Who can I get trained by? And they're like, why do you want to learn Force healing? And it's just like, well, I want to make sure that my troops don't die in battle. And then they would sense that he's lying. Or at least partially lying. And then they would ask more questions. And then they would ask more questions. And eventually they might realize that he is holding out on them. And they might investigate him and figure out he's got a wife. And that's true in the military as well. When you are in the military, and I know this because I'm in the military, if somebody asks you a question, give like as precise an answer as possible. Yes, sir. That is exactly what it is. Or no, sir. Or we are doing it this way, sir. And it should be done in like 2 hours, sir. Don't be like, well, I think we should do it this way, but I think there might be some problems because this guy might have some issues and we don't really know if it's going to work out the way we want it to. You don't get iffy on an answer, because if you're iffy on an answer, that'll make your like superior nervous, and he'll start asking more questions, and then he'll start to think you're incompetent, and therefore he'll look bad on you. Therefore, so from Anakin's point of view, his point of view is, I don't want to ask anybody to teach me this, because then somebody will know that I'm trying to learn this, and that will raise questions, and I don't want to ask permission for those tomes, because again, that will raise questions. But if I'm a master, I can just go, look it up, read it, nobody will ever know, I will learn the ability, and therefore, nobody will even know I know the power. Therefore, nobody will ever question me on why I know the power. And if it ever comes up, I can be like, oh, I just did extra studying in my... just to, like, impress people. Just to expand my horizons or whatever. And then as a Jedi Master, like, whatever knight or other master who asked him that question, it's like, why do you know that? And he'll be like, oh, because I just wanted to expand my horizons. And then the master or Jedi Knight will be respectful enough to not ask questions, because the masters are on equal footings, they're not superior to him, therefore they can't demand an answer. And a Jedi Knight would just be like, oh yes, you're very wise, yes, yes. Because they're, well, not an inferior, but a subordinate. So again, this is a very long video just to say that he is a valued member of the Jedi Council, one of the best Jedi Masters in the entire Order. He's not the reason why the Order fell. The Order technically fell because of Anakin and Palpatine, not because Ki-Adi-Mundi was blind to the fact that Palpatine happened to have a very specific dark side ability to hide his intentions from people. Like, you can't blame Ki for not knowing what he didn't know. Like, you can't say that, like, oh, he should have known Palpatine was the Sith. How would he know that? You can't assume that, like, oh no, if he had just believed whatever Yoda had told him, they would have figured out that Palpatine was the Sith. Yoda didn't even figure out that Palpatine was the Sith. So how would Ki trusting Yoda suddenly helped them figure out that Palpatine was the Sith. Again, that doesn't make any sense. You can see, like, oh, but he's not a good enough, like, detective. He should have been able to suss out Palpatine on his own. Well, nobody else sussed him out. And you're trying to lay the blame on that, on the Jedi Order, and because Ki happens to be the quintessential Jedi Master, therefore you have to blame it on Ki and everyone just like Ki. Which again, doesn't really make any sense. So putting him lower in the rankings because Ki is the quintessential Jedi and the Jedi Order failed, it is a little bit strange. And then you can be like, well, Ki should have known that Anakin was conflicted and he should have figured out that Anakin had a wife. Why would he figure that out? That doesn't make any sense either. He wasn't that close to Anakin. He wasn't like Anakin's keeper. He wasn't Anakin's like therapist. Yoda was Anakin's therapist. Yoda was the person that Anakin went to for advice. Yoda was the one that failed Anakin in that regard. Obi-Wan was the one who failed Anakin in that regard because he knew Anakin better than anybody. And he never went up to him and was like, Anakin, so, what's with you and Padme? And Obi-Wan could have been like, look, just tell me what's going on with you and Padme. Like, I get, like, the whole, you know, what do you call it? Plausible deniability aspect. But this is something that's actually important, and I'm your best friend. Can you at least tell me what's kind of going on? I mean, I want to respect your space and everything. Basically, Obi-Wan, when he got promoted to Master, decided to have plausible deniability by not asking Anakin what was going on with Padme. Because if he knew, he would be obligated to tell the Order. Or at the very least, if they were questioned about it later, he would have to be like, yeah, I knew, he told me, but he's my friend, I didn't want to, like, ruin a good thing he had. And he would also be punished by the Jedi Order, maybe even stripped of his masterhood by, like, unanimous assent from the other masters. Because a master could technically lose being a master if all the other masters agreed that he shouldn't be a master anymore. Or in theory, if the Grand Master was like, no, I don't want you to be a master anymore. You are exiled. So Obi-Wan wanted to keep plausible deniability. And again, you can kind of blame Anakin's fall on Obi-Wan though, because he decided that plausible deniability and staying out of his friend's business was more important than the Order. But it's also Palpatine that got Anakin close to Padme in the first place. So would you blame Would you blame Padme? Would you blame Palpatine? Would you blame Obi-Wan? Or would you blame Anakin? Or would you blame the Jedi Order in general? And what people do in reviews of Ki is they blame the Jedi Order in general. And because Ki is the quintessential Jedi, they blame Ki. Because it was Ki and people like Ki that caused all this to happen. And again, I think that's just a really bad assumption. You can put the blame on a lot of people, but you can't put it all on Ki and the Jedi Order in general. You can put it on Yoda, you can put it on Obi-Wan, you can put it on Palpatine, you can put it on Padme, you can put it on Anakin. Like, it doesn't balance out. It's not like one person was more responsible than anybody else. Except, yes, we know who was responsible. Anakin. Because Anakin was the deciding factor. Anakin was the one who didn't tell the truth. Anakin was the one who didn't want to reveal. Anakin was the one who didn't want to stick to the Jedi rules of, like, not having a wife and kids. Because Anakin should have known that people have left the Jedi Order in the past, and that they could leave at any time, and that they could have their wife and kids. They could have their abilities. Anakin was, like, kind of being selfish. Now, from my point of view, a Jedi should be allowed to have a wife and kids. But that's not on the Jedi Order. They just know that it's safer to not have a wife and kids. Anakin was the one who decided to have a wife and kids. Anakin was the one who wasn't able to balance out his mind, balance out his affection, and his duty as a Jedi. Anakin was the one who didn't want to give up his power as the Jedi. Anakin was the one who couldn't admit that he had put himself in this predicament. It was all on Anakin. You can blame Palpatine as much as you want. You can blame the Jedi Order as much as you want. But in the end, the decision to turn against Mace Windu and the Jedi Order was Anakin. You can blame him as not being able to adapt to the Jedi Code, but blaming the Jedi Code in general doesn't really make sense. That's just my personal opinion. And while I think Jedi should be allowed to have a wife and kids, there would have to be some kind of system in place where, like, the other Jedi come together and they're like, look, listen. They go up to the Jedi who has a wife and kids and they're like, look, we've been watching you for a while. We don't think you're handling this. We don't want you to give up your wife and kids. We just recommend that you retire. And you can raise your wife and kids. Once they're all grown and doing whatever, maybe we'll allow you to come back if you're willing to, like, allow them to continue on without you. And you're able to sever your connection with them. However, the problem is that you're so connected to them and it's making you, like, it's clouding your judgment, and we don't think you can hold up to our standards. And it's not your fault, because we let you have a wife and kids. So we'll just say that you're retiring and you can just focus on your family, and therefore you won't have the stress of this job anymore. And we'll make sure that you still get a pension or whatever, so that you're never financially in hardship. I think that would be a better way to do it. The problem with the Jedi Order in that regard is that they were kind of afraid that so many Jedi would eventually fall out that, like, more than half wouldn't be able to, like, let's say, like, everyone in the Jedi Order decided to have a wife and kids, or a husband and kids. Like, they think that, like, half of them wouldn't be able to continue on as a Jedi. Therefore, there would be half as many peacekeepers. Therefore, many more people throughout the galaxy will die because there's not enough people to keep the peace. But they could compensate for that by bringing in either more younglings, or because the Jedi are producing children, that the children will then be force sensitive and they can be brought into the Jedi Order and they can be trained up to snuff, and therefore that will keep up the number of peacekeepers. So I think if the only problem that the Jedi Order had is that they were both too selfless, which is weird. They were too selfless, and they should have all been allowed to have a wife and kids. All the wife and kids should have been protected as thoroughly as possible so they couldn't be used against the Jedi. And then if a Jedi got too attached or unable to control their emotions, that they would be kicked out, but they would highly suggest that the children then be inducted into the Jedi Order to replace the Jedi that had been kicked out. Now, if 2 Jedi had fallen in love, that's where you would lose 2 Jedi for every 1 Jedi gained. So, at the very least, they would... Best case scenario is they're like, you can have a wife and kids, but you cannot marry an elder Jedi. And then do it like that. And you could say, oh, there would be different issues with that way of doing things. And then you could try to blame Anakin's fall on the Jedi Order. But the thing is, if Anakin had just spoken up and said, like, hey, I got a wife, I got kids on the way, I don't know what to do. This all came on so fast. I know I made a mistake. He was afraid that he would be punished and kicked out of the Order for it. And then they see Ki as being allowed to have wife and kids as unfair. Therefore, Ki is the bastard. Because he's allowed to have a wife and kids. Why can't Anakin? Well, because Ki's species is unique. Okay, why isn't Ki, like, kicked out? And then Ki's daughters inducted into the Jedi Order instead. He had 7 daughters. All of them should be Force sensitive, right? Not technically the case. Not technically, if you marry somebody outside the Jedi Order, your kids don't technically automatically become Force sensitive. That's not how it works. You could try. They're probably stronger in the Force than the average person. Maybe not strong enough to become a Jedi, but you could try. But again, I think, before I keep going in circles, I rank probably Ki as like the 3rd best Jedi Master in the entire, like, in the entire Jedi Order. Probably behind Yoda. And Mace is a weird case. I would either put Mace in 2nd or I would put Obi-Wan in 2nd. And then Mace or Obi-Wan in 4th, depending on who was there. But I think Ki is like a solid, like, 3rd place. And it just seems so unfair to Ki to put him so low on the chart, because he's the quintessential Jedi Order, and the Jedi Order was wrong for what they did to Anakin and all the other younglings. Except for the fact that Anakin he fell to the dark side. And throughout, like, the 25,000 year history of the Jedi Order, only 20 Jedi Masters fell either to the dark side or left the Jedi Order. Only 20 in 25,000 years. And not all 20 of them fell to the dark side. A lot of them just left the Jedi Order because they disagreed with the direction the Jedi were going in. I would say that is some good numbers right there. That is some very good numbers right there. I would say that's pretty dang good. Now you could what about all the Padawans and Jedi Knights and Jedi that fell to the dark side or left the Jedi Order? Then the success failure rate would be much, much higher. But again, throughout the Clone Wars, there were 10,000 Jedi still alive by the end of the war. At the start of the war, there were again about 10,000. Given the ones that died during the war and the Padawans that were elevated to Jedi throughout the course of the war, I would say there was probably only about 11,000. And out of the 11,000, probably about 10 fell to the dark side or left the Jedi Order. Even if you would assume the number was like 100 Jedi fell to the dark side or left the Jedi Order during that period, out of 11,000, that's like less than 1%. That is still very good numbers. Very, very good numbers. And it would be like, everyone would agree, it's like, look, you can't blame the Jedi Order for not having a 100% success rate. That's ridiculous. Some people are just going to fail in their test, and they're not going to be able to succeed. And that's not the Jedi Order's fault. Having a 99.9% success rate actually speaks volumes on how good the Jedi actually were. So you can't blame the Jedi Order for its own fall. You can say that as a whole they failed to stop Palpatine, but the Jedi Order did succeed. Yoda, Obi-Wan, and at least 120 Jedi survived Order 66, and the Jedi Order, through Obi-Wan and Yoda, created a new apprentice that destroyed the Sith. So that you could argue that the Jedi Order failed, but only temporarily so. They only failed for a 20-year period where the Jedi Order came back from the brink, and Luke, as a member of the Jedi Order, succeeded. Or you could argue that Luke was an entirely new Jedi Order because he was an Order of One, and he had a different opinion than the Order as a whole did. He had a different opinion from what Obi-Wan thought was possible. And again, you're getting into semantics there at that point, and I've gone way too much into semantics. Anyways, I'm going to leave it there. This has gone on long enough because I'm now going in semantics for this, where this is all just supposed to be how good of a Jedi Master I thought Ki-Adi-Mundi was. And I think, again, he would be in like 3rd place for how good he was as a Jedi Master. So, anyways, I'll leave it there. There's a lot more about his backstory that I didn't get into, but it's not important. So, bye guys.